Welcome to the Fantasy Champions Fantasy Football Podcast. Here's your host, Morgan Colby and Rick Lemon.
What's going on, Fantasy Champs? My name is Morgan Colby. Rick Lemon is not with me, as always. He is going to probably provide you with a show tomorrow, but our schedules didn't link up. So Rick Lemon is not with me today, but I am here to give you Week 10 starts and sits. It is our weekly starts and sits show. I'll give you some guys to start in your starting lineups this week, help you get some dubs, and some guys that you should take out of your lineup that will probably damage your chances at winning a game. Some big-time busts that you should avoid sticking in your lineup for this week. Before we do the starts and sits, I'll try to get it through as fast as possible. Check our website, fantasyjimmies.com. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or any other podcasting platforms, please leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, click the bell for notifications, like, and comment down below. I hope you're doing well. I hope you are having a wonderful week as we prepare for Week 10 of the NFL season. I know my team, New England Patriots, are on a bye, so I can finally watch football in peace on Sunday and root for my fantasy team. Hopefully you guys are in a really good place with your fantasy teams. Rick will provide some trade targets and some buys and sells on tomorrow's show. If not, it might be me, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But he'll provide some trade targets on that show, help you build your team going into the weekend and as we approach some deadlines. So be sure to check that episode out. But without further ado, let's jump into starts and sits for Week 10. We're going to start with the starts, jump to the sits, and give you some of that information now. So number one on the list is Amon-Ra St. Brown. And there has been some, to me, I feel like there's some, among the fantasy community, there really isn't a whole ton of concern about this player. And he's actually, played relatively well in the season. But Amon-Ra has kind of come back down to earth since his torrid start in the first couple weeks of the season. He had 20, 39, 13 to start the season. The 20 and 39 and the pace of like 10 targets a game was insane. And it was like, this guy is going to see a ton of targets. He's going to get a ton of work. And the assumption was that, for me at least, he was going to be a top 5 wide receiver, top 6, 7 wide receiver in fantasy football rest of season. Right now, according to the ECR rest of season, he is currently, bear with me for a second as I pull it up. He is currently wide receiver 8. And nothing has really changed with Amon-Ra in terms of what the fantasy community thinks of him. But if you're sitting at home and you have Amon-Ra on your many fantasy teams, and maybe you're not a fantasy analyst like myself or Rick or other people in the fantasy community, and you're like, Amon-Ra really hasn't been performing for me lately. Since he missed the game in Seattle in Week 4, he's had 5 against New England, a bye week, 1 against Dallas, 13 against Miami, and 9 against Green Bay. And his schedule doesn't look to be getting any easier against Chicago, the Giants, and Buffalo in the next 2 or 3 weeks. The concern here, obviously, is, the Lions, since playing New England, have not been efficient offensively. They haven't looked great. Amon-Ra has had small snap percentages. He's missed time. The last 2 weeks, he finally has jumped up to 95, 97 snap percentage, which are the 2 largest on the season. He's had 10 and 9 targets in those 2 games. The big thing about Amon-Ra is that I think a lot of people are probably, it sounds crazy to a fantasy analyst that they would say this, but Amon-Ra is he wasn't drafted as a high capital wide receiver. He's like a 5th, 6th round pick. So, he was a guy that was edging, if you have one flex, he was a guy edging your starting lineup on a week to week basis. And then when he was playing really well to start, you obviously moved him up in the world. But, as a, wide receiver 11, wide receiver 4 in weeks 1 and 2, that obviously changed things a little bit. But as we've gone down the line here, it just hasn't been good. And I think I want to instill some confidence in you as you go about this, because I feel like there's a lot of people out there that would feel like Amon-Ra St. Brown is not a good start on a week-to-week basis. And I want to encourage you and say, stick with it, stay with it. Amon-Ra St. Brown is getting 9 targets a game when he is playing in a full capacity. So you definitely should have him on in your starting lineup on a week-to-week basis. I do believe he's a top 10 wide receiver when he's active and out there and getting targeted. And they just traded Hawk, so I think that only means good things for Amon-Ra St. Brown as well. They're also going to have Jameson Williams coming out at some point. When that happens, that'll draw some attention away from Amon-Ra. So, with all of this being said, Amon-Ra, I think, is a really good play rest of season. But this game against Chicago makes it really easy. I wouldn't question my decision to start him because he hasn't been performing well. I think this week is poised to be a big week for Amon-Ra. So he's playing the Chicago Bears, and the Bears, on the season have given up a 25 fantasy points a game to the wide receiver position, which is about middle of the pack for wide receivers, probably on the lower end of the league. But there's two things about Amon-Ra. A, he's playing the Chicago Bears, who aren't great defensively. And I think defensively, they took a step back by trading, I think it was their linebacker, Roquan Smith. And they also took a step. They really don't have a great secondary. And a lot of times, the pace of play that the Bears offense plays with slows down the pace of the game, which causes, a lower point total for wide receivers. But there's no other receivers in the wide receiver room for the Detroit Lions. And with that being said, Amon-Ra St. Brown comes into this situation where he can get probably a plethora of those 25 fantasy points. I think he's going to get targeted 10 to 12 times. I think he's got a good matchup this week, and I think he can play to a large extent. I wouldn't be nervous about starting him because he hasn't played up to potential in PPR leagues, but I would just slide him in the lineup, and you won't regret it. Start of the week, Amon-Ra St. Brown. The second guy that we have on this list is Devonta Smith versus Washington. Now, on a contrasting point, obviously, I like both Amon-Ra and A.J. Brown in this game. It's a really easy matchup. For both these guys, specifically against Washington. Washington has given up, I believe, 30. I think they're 7th worst in the league in terms of stopping wide receivers from catching the ball and giving up fantasy points. They have 30 fantasy points a game given up to the wide receiver position. The worst is 40. But the third worst is 33. So they're right there with some of the worst teams in the league, and it's an easy matchup for this guy. I think you should slide him in your lineup just because it's a super simple play. The concern with Devonta Smith is that they really only get him the ball when they say they're going to get him the ball. It seems like A.J. Brown is the guy, and he's had weeks where he's had 7, 12, 11, 5, 8 targets, and then he has weeks where he has 4, and 2 targets, and you're just disappointed on the week. I think this is a week against Washington where, the ball gets spread around. Devonta Smith gets, 8, 9 targets and has a really good game. The last time they played Washington, Devonta Smith had 30 fantasy points, 8 catches on 12 targets, 169 yards and a touchdown. So I think Devonta Smith, great start this week, great play this week. He's had a stretch of games that he hasn't really performed too well. So I think he's due for a big game, and this is a great matchup against the Washington Commanders. Going into the next matchup, we have, and the final start of the week for us is Tony Pollard at the Green Bay Packers. Now, Zeke is most likely going to play, and this carousel of fun that we put ourselves through with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard is ridiculous. If you have Zeke, you think Pollard should, if you have Zeke, you think Zeke should be the guy. If you have Pollard, you think Pollard should be the guy. Pollard is a really good running back, and Zeke has been, for the most part on the season this year, having one of his least efficient seasons of his career, 4.06 yards a carry. So he's just above that 4 yards a carry mark. He's been really good. I think he's a wonderful player. But Zeke is on the older side. He lacks explosiveness, and I do think Pollard should be the guy. The main thing about Ezekiel Elliott on the season is that he's questionable. He had an injury 2 weeks ago. He missed a game. and he's officially questionable against the Packers. Now, if Zeke was not going to run, Pollard 1,000% should be in your starting lineups. Green Bay blows, and I'll get to that in a second, against the run, and that means Tony Pollard is going to eat in this game if that is the case. But a report from Rotoballer says that Dallas Cowboys running back Ezekiel Elliott is officially listed as questionable for Week 10 against the Green Bay Packers with his knee injury. ESPN Dallas's Todd Archer truly believes Elliott will be a game-time decision on Sunday afternoon, which makes him an even riskier fantasy option this weekend. The Cowboys fully expect the 27-year-old to return after missing the Week 8 game, but fantasy managers should be wary of Ezekiel Elliott. We'll see a diminished backfield role coming off the Week 9 bye, especially since backup Tony Pollard dominated with 100-plus rushing yards and 3 touchdowns with Zeke out in Week 8. Elliott was a limited participant all week and profiles as a shaky RB2 in fantasy if he returns. So, essentially, based on the report, I don't know how accurate this report is, but I do think that there's some merit to the situation with Ezekiel Elliott being limited as well. So I like Tony Pollard in this game regardless. If Zeke is limited and Pollard gets a lot of run, this should be a good game for him. But just to bring up some of the numbers, the Green Bay Packers on the season have given up a total of 20 fantasy points a game to the running back position. So if Zeke is limited in any way, that could benefit Tony Pollard. I am a little bit nervous about Zeke getting a large run, but if he doesn't play, this is a great start. And I think Green Bay's run stopping game is really not good. So I would start Tony Pollard this week without question, and be happy with that. Let's move to some sits on the week. Some good sits. See what we can do for your fantasy team. Get in your lineup. Number 1 is Najee Harris versus New Orleans. And this season has been, this should have been a prediction for a lot of people. I had Najee Harris ranked 6 in my rankings in my draft rankings in the draft season back in August. And on the season, he's been a top 12 running back just one time in PPR, struggling to get going. He's had 10, 13, 13, 7, 6, 12, 11, and 11 on the season. He's going out against New Orleans this week, which is a pretty tough matchup on the season. And I just don't think that there's a lot to be. Unless there's not a lot of touchdown upside in this offense, so that's where you kind of have to start. And efficiency wise, these are the yards per carry total on Najee Harris: 2.3, 3.7, 3.73, 4.1. 1.82, 3, 3.82, 4. On the season, he's averaging 3.34 yards a carry. That's atrocious. That's horrible. That's something you do not want to see on an average for a running back. And I think the offensive line's not great. The offense is inefficient. Things aren't going well for Najee Harris. And I think this is just a situation where, the feelings of Najee Harris being that RB1 that you drafted him to be are just like, I think if you drafted Najee Harris to be your RB1, you're probably not in contention for the playoffs right now. Maybe you are, but if you're fighting for your playoff life and you somehow won a couple of games here and got lucky, maybe you drafted Travis Etienne in the 3rd round and he's been doing great for you, and you've got a couple of wins on the year and your record's 4-5 or 5-4. Najee Harris should come out of your lineup this week. They're going up against the New Orleans Saints. New Orleans so far this year has been worse against the run, but they're giving up 19 fantasy points a game to the running back position. And to me, this is not a game where I would go on the lower end of that. I think this is going to be like a 7, 8, 9 fantasy point performance for Najee Harris. I don't think he's going to absolutely shred and have a really good game in this game. It's a tough run defense, for a bad offensive line to deal with. And Najee's just going to have a tough time getting going in this game. So I feel like at this point, I'm okay sitting Najee Harris against the New Orleans Saints. I think this is a smart sit on the week. I don't think he gets over 40 fantasy points on the week. I don't think he scores a touchdown. I don't think he gets over 40 rushing yards on the week, and I don't think he scores a touchdown either. Big concern here is, does he get the pass catching work? And I think with Mitch Trubisky, I don't think he's going to get that. So To me, Najee is a safe sit this week. I think there'll be weeks to start him. Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Atlanta, like those matchups could be good weeks to start Najee Harris. But this week, he's also got Carolina and the Raiders coming up too. So, and Baltimore, who, hasn't been great defensively all year. Twice. So like this, after this New Orleans game, I think things lighten up a little bit for Najee Harris, and maybe, the offense improves coming off the bye and things get better. But until some things get better offensively and the schedule lightens up, Najee Harris, I think, is a no-go. Number 2 is Denver running backs versus Tennessee. More specifically, I wanted to hit on Melvin Gordon and Chase Edmonds, because I think with the trading of, a lot of people think it's going to be a 3-headed backfield and all this nonsense. It's going to be Najee Harris. I mean, not Najee Harris. It's going to be Melvin Gordon, and it's going to be Chase Edmonds. Those are the 2 running backs that you're going to be looking at in fantasy. And I was about to drop Chase Edmonds. I'm not going to lie. I was about to drop Chase Edmonds. I did not want him on my team. I was about to ditch and run on Chase Edmonds. And then right before that happened, he got traded to the Denver Broncos. So I figured, hey, why not hold this guy and see what happens? This week is not the week I want to test it. I want to sit him on my bench and wait and see with Chase Edmonds to see how things pan out. If he has a good game, you can come roast me in the comments, but I'll be okay with sitting him on my bench and watching him have a good game. I don't think it happens this week because he's playing Tennessee, but and Melvin Gordon, who has been getting some of the work, but not all of it. You also got Lat Murray in that backfield, so there's a lot of different stuff with those Denver running backs. But you're probably thinking, if you have Chase Edmonds, okay, maybe him getting traded to the Denver Broncos is a life send, because their running game has not been great since Javonte went down. Things haven't looked super efficient for their offense in general, so maybe adding Chase Edmonds to that backfield, they'll get him more involved and it'll become more efficient, and then they can try to get some other things going offensively. I don't know that that's going to happen. For running backs going up against the Tennessee Titans this year, 16 fantasy points per game given up. I just talked about how, you're going up and playing the New Orleans Saints, getting 19 fantasy points. This is 16 fantasy points a game for a backfield that is going to be most likely littered with snaps from Mike Boone and snaps for Latavius Murray and snaps from Melvin Gordon and snaps for Chase Edmonds. This is not a week to start any of these guys. And maybe somebody emerges from that backfield this week and they go with Chase Edmonds. I don't know. They didn't give up a whole ton of... The trade that they made had nothing to do with Chase Edmonds. I think it was just an added deal because they needed to fix their running back room for right now. The main portion of it was the picks they got. But maybe Chase Edmonds goes to the Denver Broncos and they start to give him some work. We got to see if that happens. So for Chase, I'm not starting Chase Edmonds because I don't think they're going to give him the work, and I don't think that that's going to be a situation where they're going to run out and hand the ball off to him a million times right away. And I also don't think this is a good week to test the waters with him. Maybe they do give him 100 carries, and maybe they do give him the full benefit of the work. They treat him like Javonte Williams. If that happens, he might have a good game, but I think against Tennessee, it's tough. So just be leery of that with Chase Edmonds. I wouldn't start him this week. And then for the other guy that I was talking about, Melvin Gordon, Gordon has had times where he's been decent this year, and then times that he has been, really, really not good. On the season, he's had 16, 13, 14-point games. But when he's had bad matchups, they haven't been good. He's only been an RB. He's been a high-end RB2 one time, but the rest of the time he's not been great. And he's only getting like half the snaps. So Melvin Gordon makes a really tough entry into this. I think if you're looking for a start this week at running back, I would go elsewhere. I wouldn't start Melvin Gordon. I would sit him for the week and go with somebody else. So Melvin Gordon, sit him down. Chase Edmonds, sit him down. All Denver Broncos running backs, sit him down. Don't play him this week. You will regret it if you do. And finally, the last guy, this one's a little bit hotter of a take, and Rick would cut my head off if he heard this one. So hopefully he's not listening to the show. But it's Terry McLaurin at the Philadelphia Eagles. Curtis Samuel also could be in this situation. But I go with Terry McLaurin because I think, Philly's been good stopping the pass, but I think the main guy that is going to be on Terry McLaurin this week is their I don't mean shutdown corner, but is their main cornerback. And I think McLaurin's matchup is tough this week. Whereas Samuel, I think, gets a lot of targets. He can rack it up in the PPR department and still give you a decent fantasy week. So I'm not as afraid to start Curtis Samuel this week as Terry McLaurin. McLaurin's been good on the season, though. 18, 12, 16, 3, 12, 8, 18, 16, and 10 in the first 9 weeks of the season. This game against Philly is a very tough matchup. He's been getting 8 to 9 targets a game. He's been catching some touchdowns on given weeks. He's been putting together good fantasy performances, and I don't think Terry McLaurin is a bad play if you must start him this week. But Philadelphia on the season against wide receivers has given up a total of 24 fantasy points a game to the wide receiver position. And like I said, I do believe that there's a situation right now where Terry McLaurin is going to get matched up against the number one corner for the Philadelphia Eagles. And with that being said, I think that a bunch of these fantasy points are going to go Curtis Samuel's way as the slot receiver and the dump-off guy, and I think that Terry McLaurin is going to take a hit. He's going to have one of those 5-6 target games with like 2-3 catches and bust out on the week. I really have a strong feeling about that. It's a tough matchup for him, and McLaurin has been, good at times and not great at times, and it's been a tough season, and not a tough season for him. But like when you're talking about, like, I think a lot of people still treat Terry McLaurin like he's this elite featured guy when realistically he hasn't really exited like the low end wide receiver 2 range. Like he's wide receiver 19 in PPR leagues on the season. And like, to me, he's been good. Like he's been a good start on a week to week basis. I think he's kind of in the same, like I hold him in the same conversation, I guess, as like a Cortland Sutton or a Jerry Jeudy in terms of what he's produced. Obviously Sutton and Jeudy have not, Sutton and Jeudy have not like had as good seasons. They've been right around wide receiver 30. So wide receiver 19 is obviously significantly better than that. So maybe I should put him in the same conversation as Devonta Smith. But to me, it's like if you have Terry McLaurin and Devonta Smith and you're trying to make a decision, I would 1,000% I would start Devonta Smith over Terry McLaurin in this game. And I think McLaurin will disappoint this week. So if he does not disappoint, you can hate me in the comments down below. But there are your 3 starts. There are your 3 sits. Be sure to get these guys in your lineup or take the guys that are sits out and try to do your best to get these guys in your lineup and set this thing up for success. We got starts and sits tomorrow, trade targets. Be sure to check those guys out. We'll see you later, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Champions Podcast. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes and YouTube and follow us on Twitter @TheFFChamps.